There are few mechanized forms of long-distance travel more lost to us than that of the train. What used to be a legitimate and efficient form of point A to point B has now become reserved to a select few who aren't so in a hurry to get to their destination. For me, the train was a novelty, a sort of invocation to cigar-smoking poets that I admire, who might have actually written their poetry on similar routes of parallel steel. I don't think this was an accident. There's so much poetry to be found in travel, so much time for reflection and analysis. Sure, this channel is normally focused on video games, but I think you would be surprised at the similarities of travel as a form of art. As you're careening through a myriad of different landscapes, the feeling of artistic voyeurism begins to take over. You're a passive viewer, as if you're walking through an art exhibit. Different pieces come and go, and the exhibition is just as open to interpretation as any watercolor, movie, or video game. This begs the question, then, what can we learn from the desert? What is the rhetoric of the Rocky Mountains? How do we reconcile authorship? Who is the intended audience? Who is to say that the muted colors of an overcast Iowa countryside holds any less value than that of the Sierra Nevada? These questions, these thoughts, are just another form of interpreting art, the same we ask ourselves of any piece of rhetoric. I have to say, I could never allow myself to just write about video games, regardless of my audience. That being said, timestamps for different parts will be in the description. I hope you enjoy this video. Now, of course, not all travel is the same. You don't need me to tell you this, but one can find themselves going somewhere with the destination as the goal, or going somewhere with the journey in mind. That being said, earlier this summer, I did the latter. In an effort to learn more about other cultures and ways of living, I took a transcontinental trip on the Amtrak railroads. Accompanying my friend Anthony, we flew to San Francisco, stayed for 2 days, then hopped on the Amtrak California Zephyr, which took us from Emeryville, California to Chicago, Illinois, over the course of 3 days. From Chicago, we hopped on another Amtrak train, the Lakeshore Limited, which took us to New York City, where we stayed with my brother for 2 more days. Another train to Washington, D.C., then a plane back home to the middle of the country. I want to explore this trip not as an expression of narcissism or bragging, but instead as an analysis, much like I would do on this channel for any video game. An in-depth look at what we can learn from different forms of rhetoric, as well as the cultural and practical lessons learned from the art itself. That being said, the footage here is not used in the same way as I normally would with the video game review. It's mostly just artsy-fartsy vids I took through the trip, and while I think watching it helps contribute to that form of passive voyeurism, it isn't as important and thus not as cleanly edited. Moving on. I think this is sort of a universal experience for a lot of people. It goes a little something like this. Hey dude, we should do this thing. Dude, that's so awesome, I'm stoked, we have to do this. For sure dude, I can't wait, this is gonna be so sick. Now normally these dudes never actually do this thing, which is fine of course, it's just most big exciting trips one could organize normally become less exciting the more you think about the money, planning, and logistical work necessary to making it a reality. I was originally going to make this trip alone. I had mentioned that I was going to do it with my friend Anthony over dinner at one point. Short story shorter, he seemed interested and I said, sure, yeah, come, all aboard. We were friends for sure, but certainly not lifelong friends who have done this sort of thing before. Come to think of it, this was one of the first times we hung out outside of college, just the two of us. Maybe you can confirm or deny, Anthony. The point is here, we actually did it. I don't know if it was our personalities or what, but we ended up getting all of the tickets and hotels and planning done in about a week. It's nuts if you ask me, absolutely nuts. When I originally convinced myself of the idea, however, I jokingly called it a Journey of Self-Discovery, or JSD. I know that's a bit dramatic, but it's about the principle. I felt trapped in the Midwest. I felt like I lived in an echo chamber of culture and ideology, a place that I wasn't hurting in by any stretch, but certainly stagnating. I'm sure some of you can relate. I've lived in the same state my entire life. It was time I made an effort to learn more about outside of it. And trust me, the comedy of me going on this trip to San Francisco with one other man is not lost on me. And trust me, that isn't nearly as funny as the looks we got from people on the train. Now, they weren't bad looks, mind you, but inquisitive looks, as if they had a dying need to just ask us if we were an item. Keeping them in suspense was a good pastime for the sometimes boring dinner table conversations on the train. It was when I would slip in a comment about my girlfriend back home, it was as if some weight had gone off their shoulders and they could speak uninhibited. I absolutely digress though. San Francisco is great. It's one of the neatest cities I've ever been to. I've actually never been to California before, so experiencing it was necessary before we hopped on the train. The eventual contrast of the city and nature we saw on the train was absolutely present in my mind across the whole trip. The city, being just as much of an expression of the self as any piece of art is, was a diverse and exciting time for me. I've always lived in small towns. Learning the metro system and how to get from point A to point B in the cheapest way possible was exciting to me in the same way as any puzzle is. It started as learning the preferred methods of transportation. Once you learn that, the BART system is the easiest way to get from the hotel to the city. You have to learn the routes and the timings first, though. Where do you get tickets? How do you get to the station itself? What you end up with is a self-defined system of commute, one that I learned and committed to memory but probably won't ever use again. But it doesn't matter, it was part of the fun. I say the city is an expression of the self not in its totality, but instead how it separates itself, just as the landscape does further inland. Spend any considerable time walking, and you will encounter so many different obvious boundaries of culture, not but defined by any sort of jurisdiction or arbitrary lines. This is to say that our trip from the hotel to downtown contained so many different forms of living, so many different forms of culture and people. You wouldn't even have to look out the window to make this apparent. Even just the people that get on the train can tell a story. The suits and contemporary techie business wear of Silicon Valley to the suburban bliss of Bay Area suburbs. Sweaty, dirty residents of the more industrial areas of the Bay to the teenager whose Bubba Gump's uniform. It tells just enough of a story and just enough of a justification for their apathetic demeanor. There's gay districts, business districts, bad parts of towns, good parts of towns, touristy parts of towns, hipster parts of town. And don't get me wrong, I understand this is a case in all metropolitan areas, but the division, the sheer fragmentation was what was so alarming to me. You begin to see how the biomes of the United States and the cultural divisions of the city are not so different. When you're on the train, you may be in a desert in the morning and a snowy mountainside at night. The city is no different, in a micro sense, of course. At 8:15 in the morning, you may find yourself next to Facebook and other millionaires, and at 8:30 you may find yourself in some sort of industrial hell. Walk a couple blocks, and by 9 in the morning, you'll be immersed in San Francisco's market district. The point here is that I'm making that the differences between city and country are obvious, but the similarities are a little less discursive. But they're there. In San Francisco, as we were headed home from dinner, something very unusual happened. Well, I think it's unusual, but as I'm starting to see how usual it is, I may be wrong. I forgot something at the restaurant. I forgot the gift I got for my girlfriend. I would have never noticed it not for Anthony pointing out the lack of gift bag. I bring this up because it ended up being one of my favorite memories from the entire trip. We were so tired. We walked around 12 miles previously and our legs were like jelly. I asked if we should just grab an Uber back to the restaurant and he said no. We ended up walking back both ways, alarmed at the amount of joggers and beautiful people that lived in San Francisco. We talked about everything. It was some of the best conversation of the whole trip. I think travel is a really fragile thing to do. One way to make sure it ends up being a good experience, however, is to travel with someone great. All right, let's get to the train. The California Zephyr is an Amtrak superliner train, meaning that it has multiple levels. A normal day to day on the train really depends on the seating package you got. For us, we got a roomette, which had 2 seats which could be folded into beds, as well as some other stuff. This was pretty expensive and honestly accounted for most of the expense of the entire trip, given that it was 3 nights. I'd like to go off the script here for a bit and just kind of narrate what you're seeing. I know a lot of you are probably clicking on this video, trying to get an idea of what you're going to be able to see on the Amtrak California Zephyr. That being said, this is the observation car. It's where we actually spent a lot of our time. We sat down in it. We pretty much just socialized, talked, everything like that. You move through the cars while it's moving by pressing these buttons. It's not dangerous at all, but you got to wear shoes. So here you get an idea for the dining car. Now this is so interesting to me. It's, in a lot of ways this is sort of like a small cruise or RV or something like that. Here you go for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they'll serve you food with a menu. It's absurdly expensive, so if you don't have a roomette, consider bringing your own food. Some of the meals can get up to like $30. It's quite a lot, but if you get a roomette, the meals are included. As we go into here, we're just going to see a bunch of sleeping cars and kind of where the roomettes are, the rooms, all the different ways of Amtrak living. Fast forward a bit to our roomette, actually. I don't really remember what number it was, but as you can see, you actually have your own sliding door that can be covered by curtains. You'll see the first 2 seats. This is where you sit. They'll give you water bottles and stuff like that. There's actually that thing in the middle will fold out as a table. Say hello. And the seats are good, but if you are both sitting there, your knees will kind of hit each other a bunch. As you can see, there's a closet, although it's not much of a closet, but it's serviceable. And above is actually the top bunk. So that's where one of the two will be sleeping when they fold out the chairs. Waking up, you are given the opportunity to eat breakfast on the train. There's an observation car which gives you a lot more opportunity to see outside, and this is where we spent most of our time. Meals are free of charge with the roomette. Well, they're sort of free of charge. They're included in the original ticket. The cool thing about the meals, though, is that you are paired with 2 other passengers, normally like a couple. They do this to save space, but it's an awesome opportunity to make some friends and meet a diverse group of people. Speaking of friends, our roomette neighbors were a group of the most hilariously cliche moms, all together in a sort of girls' night cross-country trip. All probably around 40 to 50, these ladies were the most kind and caring people ever. They obviously wanted to get away from the monotony of their lives and just drink wine on a train trip. They gave us granola bars the first time we met them, just in case we were ever hungry. We called them Mom. On this trip, I read 2 books. Carefully picked for their relevance, of course. I first read Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, a travel tale in not quite the same way as one would think. Billy Pilgrim, our main character in the book, while even though he is traveling through Europe near the end of World War II, is also traveling through time. Vonnegut writes, Billy is spastic in time, has no control over where he is going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He's in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he is going to have to act in next. I'm certain we can all relate to this. In the story, Billy is not only being forced around on rails by his SS captors, but he's also occasionally what he calls unstuck in time by a group of Tralfamadorians, a group of aliens that absolutely do not exist and is instead an extension of Billy as an unreliable narrator and his PTSD. As much as we travel through space, however, we also travel through time. In that sense, we're also on rails, you and I, unable to change direction. Billy felt this. He felt out of control. You see, that's the thing about taking a trip like this. You almost unstick yourself in time as you take full control of where you are going and when you will get there. Sure, there's stuff outside of your control, but this level of control, this authorship of your life, it's such a liberating and terrifying experience. Liberating because you are unsticking yourself from the monotony of your normal life, but it is terrifying because you are unsticking yourself from the monotony of your life. You are telling the world to stop for you because you want to explore. You take time off from work and stop your studies. It's hard to do something like this, to unstick yourself. Unfortunately for Billy, his situation was a little bit different. Yeah, this book is so great, and I understand if Vonnegut is an immediate no for you, as arguments pointing out his crutch on obscenity are not completely unfounded. It was such a surreal and cool experience, however, reading a book that has such parallels to the journey I was on at the time. In an effort to memorialize the recently deceased Robert Pirsig, I also read his classic work, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The book, if you're unfamiliar, which I highly advise not being, is about a 17-day motorcycle journey from Minnesota to Northern California. Much like Slaughterhouse 5, this book is heavily autobiographical, although it's never explicitly said to be. The book deals with the conflict of the romantic versus the modern, the practical versus the impractical, the rational versus the irrational. I find myself to be an incredibly pragmatic person. My favorite philosophers are always rationalists, not romantics. I'm far more interested in Asimov over Thoreau and find myself thinking far more about the landscape, how the landscape got so pretty versus just how pretty the landscape actually is. You see, in life, I think sometimes you enter what I like to call a gray box stage. Now, let me rewind. In video game development, before they make the level look like a ruined post-apocalyptic city, they have to first map out the level itself. So instead of ruined buildings and cars, they just put gray boxes down to get a rough idea of where the player can go. I think the longer you situate yourself somewhere, in a city or in a house or anywhere really, your life becomes closer to that gray box level design. You start seeing the pathing of where you're going as the means to get there. You notice less details. It's as if you develop such a tunnel vision that you are performing a task repetitively that you just have many times over. After a while of doing this too much, you don't even notice it anymore. It's muscle memory. I hated feeling this way. I always valued being in my head, not paying much attention to the outside world, thinking it somehow made me smarter. Now, though, I think Pirsig has taught me a lot about what it means to embrace both sides, both nature and the nature of reality. He writes, "We're in such a hurry most of the time, we never get much chance to talk. The result is a kind of endless day-to-day shallowness, a monotony that leaves a person wondering years later where all the time went and sorry that it's all gone." I think the quote speaks for itself. It's terrifying, really, the thought of sticking yourself in time so heavily that time begins to lose meaning. It's something that deeply troubles me because of how exact it actually is, how I've fallen victim to it for so many years, and I'm young. I'm troubled by it because it's true, and it is terrifying. And it goes further, too. Anthony is a poet himself. I write stuff like this. The contrast is almost exactly mirrored in the book. I'm not necessarily saying that either or is better, and I'm certainly not saying that a rationalist cannot embrace the romantic or vice versa. I do, however, believe that it becomes very easy to commit to one or the other, resulting in either crippling cynicism or absolute naivete. Comment below which club you're in. I should go back to the question of time, because time does seem to act differently in the train. What tends to happen is this. You wake up, and the first thing you do is take a look outside. The first morning I saw the deserts of western Nevada. You go through your day. You talk with people. You rest your eyes. You eat. You shower. Yeah, there are showers. Occasionally, they let you off the train for 5 minutes or so every couple of hours. A couple more hours go by, and you suddenly start to notice the desert becomes less orange. It begins to trend towards a duller, grayer surface characterized by enormous rocks and hills. The trees change from palm to pine, and suddenly you're looking up instead of straight ahead. Boom. Suddenly the Rocky Mountains. As we fell asleep that night after literally being caught in a blizzard on top of a mountain for hours, we fell asleep descending a snowy mountain. It's hard to conceptualize space and time when you go from beach to desert to blizzard to canyon to cornfield. Frankly, it makes me feel a certain patriotism that may normally be lost on me. The United States is such a tremendously large country, and it contains such an extraordinary amount of biomes. It's really incredible. Overall, the trip from Emeryville, California to Chicago took 53 hours. I can't say that the 53 hours felt like any other 53 hours I've ever experienced, but I thoroughly enjoyed unsticking myself in time. Chicago came, and we had little time. We did the normal stuff, got deep dish pizza, and we went up to the Willis Tower and sat in that terrifying observation window that sticks out from the building. I was reminded of when Pirsig said, "Sometimes it's a little better to travel than to arrive." Onto the Lakeshore Limited, a Viewliner Amtrak train, meaning it was the only one story. But it was quite a bit faster, which you can actually feel. There's nothing quite like living on the top bunk of a moving train, feeling infantile as you're rocked from side to side by an enormous mechanical horse that you just assume will stay on track. I can't say I slept well. I think Anthony did, but I just think my anxiety was through the roof. A lot of the Lakeshore's journey took place overnight. We slept in and it really felt like we were in New York City in no time. I will spare you with deliberation on New York City. It's unlike anything I have ever seen, an absolute monolithic icon to American values, freedom, corporations, and gratuitous scale. It's amazing. We took a train to Washington, D.C. after 3 days in New York City. And I'll spare you with the deliberation on Washington, D.C. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's an absolute monolithic icon to American values, freedom, corporations, and gratuitous scale. It's pretty cool. The Smithsonian's here were my favorite part. I went when I was a kid, but I obviously can appreciate these a lot more now. I had a delayed flight home and the trip was over. I can confidently say, though, that the gray boxing I had talked about earlier, it's a lot better now. I'm paying a lot closer attention. I had a lot of time to reflect on the direction I was heading. I'm generally a positive person when it comes to these sort of things. You won't hear me complain much about the direction I'm headed in terms of my career or school or relationships or life, really. I'm not the happiest person in the world, but I'm positive. I'm aware of what I have and the opportunities given to me, and I'm very thankful. I don't think, however, I have been good about being aware of my surroundings, though. As much beauty as there was in all of these different places, there's a tremendous amount of beauty even where I live. There's so much to do and see that I haven't yet even seen in my own backyard. Well, I don't have a backyard, but you get what I mean. Furthermore, I do feel a little less stuck in time. See, the thing about the monotony I mentioned earlier, that form of being stuck in time, it's hard to explain if you haven't understood it yet. Let me try this. You know, those bugs they find that are stuck in amber, it's sort of like that. To you, you are stuck in amber. Time has no real meaning. You wake up and go to work and go home and repeat. You're stuck in time. The reality, though, time is still moving. Time doesn't care about you. You're just a bug. So while your subjective experience feels like you're stuck, you are still aging. You're still wearing away to an objective time that carries very little of your existence. This trip helped me break out of that amber a bit, or at least create a little window. A window that I could look outside and see and value something beautiful. And that was worth it to me. I want to thank you guys so much for making it this far into the video. Please let me know in the comments or tweet at me if you have. It means the world when you guys do that. I know this was a little much. Some might call it pretentious or braggy, but if you like this kind of content, again, let me know. I would encourage me to write more on philosophy and thought and things like this. Basically something that's not video games. If you want me to stick to video games, also let me know that. Follow me on Twitter or say hi in the Twitch stream. Hit subscribe if you want to see more of this content and like the video. If you really liked it, go ahead and send it to someone, share it. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great night.